Faction politics. There is more to say about military matters on the campaign map, but I thought it would be nice to now take a break and instead think about the politics system. I think it will probably be too much to ask to have a unique set of political mechanics for each faction, so it will need to be something relatively general. However, not as general as the extremely vague and ultimately unimportant presentation of politics in Rome 2. Something that is shared across all factions is the existence of some form of bureaucracy into which characters can be placed. Attila made this assumption, having that tree of political positions who you could put people into. Better than Rome 2's system, but Rome 3 needs something a little more substantial. Rome 3's politics revolve around attempts by you as a faction leader to have your family and allies have as much influence as possible. Like in Attila, you will have two stats that determine how this is going, but instead of power and dominance or whatever they were, it is now a more basic pair of measures, state support and popular support. This is really harkening back to Rome 1, where you were vying to win support from both the Senate and the people. This is basically a generalized version of that. All factions have some form of state bureaucracy that has an opinion of you, be it the Senate, the tribal elders, the king's courtiers, or the city council. And of course they all have people, who will also have their own opinion that doesn't really need to match that of the state. For example, capturing new lands may please the state, but bringing soldiers back alive and rich pleases the people. Some things like defeating an invading army or improving your total wealth would please both. It's a great mechanic to use the notification scroll for. Everything you do that changes the support of the people or government will create a little message to tell you what happened and why. On the campaign map there would be a big button somewhere on the screen, probably a corner, bringing up a faction management scroll, where the proportions of the state and people supporting you would be clearly visible via diagrams. To the edge you would have a small list of the characters from your political circle, which remember is basically a set of families all allied together, who don't have a state position, and a list of all the different levels people can try to get into, similar to Attila. But unlike Attila, these positions aren't empty if you haven't filled them. Other noble families occupy it all. Now it doesn't really matter who these people from outside of your political circle are. I don't want the politics to be so deep that you are tracking the fates of other families' characters who otherwise don't have a role in the campaign. This is a key departure from Rome 1 and Rome 2. We assume that other political circles exist and are vying for positions and support just like our one is, but they're not the ruling circle. They don't have serious power other than to deny you political rank. And as I said, it doesn't matter who they actually are, all you need to know is that they are not you. This system actually makes the least sense for Rome itself, where the idea of one group of families ruling absolutely is hard to believe, especially as the consulship is elected, so your rivals would technically be telling you what to do. But for the rest of the factions it makes more sense, where generally they had ruling dynasties in control, with minor families acting as vassals to fill out the ranks of the state's administration, much closer to my political circle's concept. Perhaps the budget will allow a special system unique to each faction, but assuming it doesn't, this slightly hand-wavy and gamey concept will suffice. Now, since the political offices can be held by these mysterious not-you characters, it does mean you may have to get your character to try and oust someone to get into office, be it by election, trial by combat, bribery, whatever culturally relevant action you need, summed up by the generic command for the player called get into office or something. Over time, people in your political circle who aren't doing anything will try and win positions without your input, since they do have ambitions of their own. You'll be informed if they succeed, which is always good news, as in this simple politics system, anything good for your political circle is good for you as a player and a faction leader. Unfortunately, these independent actions rarely succeed, as people need the support and money of you as the head of the main family to boost them into all but the lowest of available positions. In this way, people who ignore the politics, which is fair to do, will over time find it has partially played itself, so you're not totally out of control. But for people who do want to play politics, you'll probably be assigning all your characters manually and boosting them into power with money. So since the automatic stuff happens only slowly, you're unlikely to come in and find that the guy you wanted to become proconsul has gone and got himself stuck in a dead-end magistrate position, unless you already ignored politics for a long time. Having your own folk in powerful positions like Rome's consul wins you a lot of state support, and it comes with its own set of bonuses for that character in particular, just like in Attila, so it's worth doing. Now some may ask, what is the point of trying to gain state support or popular support? You might guess it gives some passive bonuses or penalties based on whether you are loved or hated, just like in Rome too. You would be right, popular support would contribute a lot to the public order baseline of your lands, and Senate support would decrease financial losses from corruption and administration. But I don't want those to be the sole reasons for pursuing support. Conceptually, I want having high support to be necessary to win the campaign, for to have lots of territory but to not have control of your internal politics or the people isn't a full victory. I think the best way to explain my plan for these two support meters is to explain how they fit into a pair of new game mechanics, the mechanics to replace Rome 2's scripted civil war, as the way to restore difficulty in the late game. These mechanics are called mass rebellions and political coups, and I shall explain each separately, as I hope them to be two totally independent difficulty rebounds to make the campaign worth playing past 50 turns. Mass rebellions. While playing their mid to late campaign, the player will likely encounter an event called the Mass Rebellion. This event is the rough equivalent of the realm divide from Shogun 2, but mixed heavily with the concept of a civil war to fit the setting. In the ancient world, you as a faction are mostly occupying lands that are culturally, religiously, and ethnically different to that of your ruling class. That means you're going to have a constant undercurrent of rebelliousness throughout the majority of your lands. A mass rebellion occurs when you occupy so much land that the former nobility of these different cultures realize they can all work together to defeat you and plan a massive synchronized uprising to restore their original owners, or in cases of lands that have been occupied for a long time historically, to gain independence. The event takes place across all of your regions that are not core regions and have a public order below 0. These two conditions are what I hope will alleviate many of the complaints about sudden difficulty spikes like the Realm Divide. I hope this because they make the Mass Rebellion, if not entirely preventable, very controllable and sensible. If you expand slowly, converting lands into cores before moving on, you will be almost invulnerable to a mass rebellion, as there are never enough hostile peoples inside your territory. But then by expanding slowly, you're not going to have the economic and military advantages that brings. With the public order rule, if you manage your faction in a superb fashion and actually keep everyone happy, then the effects of the mass rebellion will be minor, as not enough people will be willing to rise up against you when the time comes. This is the point where the popular support bar from faction politics comes into play, for ruling in a manner that pleases the people causes public order improvements across all regions, and this is the surest way to minimize the amount of regions that will turn against you if a mass rebellion begins. The mass rebellion won't happen at all unless there are a set number of unhappy non-core regions in your empire, and I would like to balance the popular support mechanic such that with expert play that heavily focuses on taking the people into consideration, a mass rebellion will be virtually impossible. However, I would like to balance it such that if you spent all your efforts gaining popular support, that your state support would be low, so that you'll instead face the other disruptive mechanic, political coups. I'll talk more about the implications of this balance once I've explained what coups are. First, I just wanted to describe how a mass rebellion would go down in your campaign. You might have received a warning from your spies many turns ago that lots of resistance leaders from across your empire are rumoured to have been having meetings, hinting that something is going to happen. When the turn of the rebellion comes, you find that your income has suddenly tanked and you have lost line of sight over all your unhappy occupied territories. But they are still under your control, it seems. Your flag still flies above them and your colour still paints the map. But the fact you can't see them anymore is key, meant to inflict fear upon the player and hammer home the feeling of a loss of control. This is the build-up phase to the rebellion. You still own your rebellious lands, but most of the money they gave you is gone and you have no information from within them. Within the cloak of the fog of war, the rebel armies now gather over a period of a few turns, a critical difference to the Rome II civil war where the mobilization was sudden and could not be countered. If you sent scouts to investigate a rebelling region, let's say in Gaul, you might find that there's an army of 5 or so units under the Arverni banner, the faction you wiped out long ago to take the lands in the first place. In the next turn, there are 7. Then next there are 10. The army growing as the rebellion gets going. After, say, 5 turns, there is a sizable army in every rebelling region, and they will start attacking your settlements. If they take them, the faction they represented is restored, automatically at war with you, and with a huge boost to their own public order, meaning they can ride the wave of revolution to focus on damaging you. You can imagine this would get out of control pretty fast if it got this far across all the rebelling regions, of which there could be, say, 20. That would mean 20 armies across perhaps 7 newly restored factions, all now turning to attack your remaining loyal regions. Of course, if you have already drained the military population of all your regions, the rebels will be limited in their manpower. The whole point to this big event is that it is interactive, not a sudden event like the Civil War or Realm Divide. This event unfolds over time, so you have a small but critical period of time to react to it. So let's talk about what the player might do on turn 1 when their regions have gone dark and they know that silently a massive danger is growing beyond your core. Firstly, they turn to their existing forces. Some of their forces may have been in rebelling regions and if they are lucky would still be under control, providing some line of sight. Whether you kept forces tied up with the rebels would depend entirely on the officers in charge, so the ones that are loyal to you stay under control and ones that aren't join the rebels. So you'd better not be placing disloyal generals as the heads of your main armies, but then again maybe trusting them like that is a way to gain their loyalty, so you better hope a mass rebellion doesn't happen while you're working through these trust issues. Anyway, so the forces you do have are immediately going to make the region they are in and any adjacent regions easier to hold, because you can use them to scout out where the rebel armies are and attack them before they become strong. Rebel armies in the first couple of turns would have very low integrity, as they are still unsure if they are really strong enough to pull through with their rebellion. So if attacked by a large loyal force, they may just surrender without a fight, as discussed when we covered integrity effects. That would mean you can very quickly intimidate a couple of regions back into submission by moving around with a large army. After a couple of turns, you have hopefully secured a few regions by crushing the rebel armies before they could muster properly. But now you know the rest will have had time to get real armies together, so the action begins. This is the strategy phase, where the enemy will probably have you strategically outnumbered, providing some probably needed late-game challenge, especially if you are under attack from other factions. You won't be able to raise new troops as the rebellious regions aren't paying tax. It comes down to a question of whether you can destroy enough enemy armies before you run out of troops or money. The armies you face will probably be throwbacks to armies you faced earlier in the campaign when you first took the lands in the first place. But I think they should also have units from your faction as well, representing men from among your own faction who secretly agreed with the rebel cause and could finally turn on you. So you'll be fighting combined armies the likes of which you haven't seen yet, meaning with any luck you won't feel like you're totally retracing your steps. An interesting fact to consider is that the armies you face will have been raised from the military-aged population of your own regions, so if you go in hoping to destroy them, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Using anti-integrity tactics would work best, but that isn't always possible since these armies are easily supplied from close by and have a powerful cause to drive them. You might just have to slaughter your own people to get the rest to see reason. So this phase of the game would be hard. But one advantage you would hopefully have is that by this stage in the game your armies will be well trained and with high tier troops, so you will have an edge in battle that you didn't have the first time you fought all these enemies, making the prospect of taking them all at once a little less daunting and a little more badass. If you fight and triumph, restoring control of every region, the mass rebellion ends, and you get a massive boost to your popular support, skyrocketing public order across your empire for a long time. Remember that popular support isn't necessarily a measure of how much the people like you, it's a measure of how under your control they are, and how much they will support your actions regardless of what they are. So that's the mass rebellion. I hope you'll agree it has the potential to provide a tense, challenging late-game experience that is both believable and controllable, not the result of a scripted event, but ultimately the result of your own decisions and ruling style. I think it will feel quite fair as sudden difficulty spikes go. The mass rebellion is the consequence of ignoring the needs of your people, being militaristic and expanding quickly, things the state loves, so you would have large amounts of state support. Once the rebellion is over, you end up with control of both the state and the people, the perfect place your faction wants to be at, and probably a requirement for winning the campaign. The campaign might even end there and then if you've already achieved the victory conditions, which could be quite cool, as that last-ditch attempt by the world to resist your rule would be a fitting end. Political coups. Now let's talk about an entirely different kind of late-game challenge, one that will greet an entirely different kind of player to the mass rebellion. This is the ultimate result of having low state support rather than low popular support, caused by a playstyle where you use all your state-owned land for economic progress rather than military progress, raising the wealth of your provinces, but since you have control of that wealth personally, the rest of the upper classes aren't too happy. They want you to use state resources to expand borders and keep people safe. But if you don't feel like pissing your people off by sending them to war and would rather garner them some economic prosperity, the upper classes will start planning against you. As you can tell, the political coup is going to be something that happens to a player who expands slowly or tries to avoid wars, focusing on civil development and reinvesting income into the economy. The coup itself is something more traditional as a game mechanic. It will involve, like the mass rebellion, a sudden loss of control and loss of vision over a number of regions. But this time, the regions can be in your core, and will generally be your richest regions regardless of public order. The regions you lose will actually create a new faction right among your own lands, a faction that is basically the shadow of your own aligned against you. So if playing as Rome, the Coup faction might be SPQR, as the Senate pools its resources to wrestle control away from you. The coup will probably trigger when the economic value of your faction reaches a certain level, or perhaps just whenever state support gets too low. Like with the mass rebellion, low loyalty generals may side with the coup. Your loyal forces in the lost regions will be moved to the nearest friendly province, but with a big hit to their integrity, representing the doubt among the men as they can't really tell which side is in the right. If your integrity is low already, only some troops will make it back to your regions as the rest defect to the coup faction, giving them an initial strength boost. The mood here is quite different to the mass rebellion. This isn't a fight against an external threat, but a propaganda war among the upper classes, trying to establish who has the right to rule. The coup faction will immediately start raising all the troops it can from your former settlements. The interesting part here is that the troops they are raising will be the same as yours. They can use your military buildings and your units. So unlike the mass rebellion where you're facing large numbers of low-grade troops, this time you're very much facing your own shadow, armies with the same higher-tier units of yours, and of course a new challenge you will have had little experience with fighting against your own kinds of units, unless you had a lot of rebel generals along the way already. The fact that they are your units, perhaps with a different banner but the same colouring and equipment, as the Coup faction doesn't really have time to get all their troops to buy new gear, I hope it will really make the idea that you are literally killing your own people here stronger than it will feel in the mass rebellion. Especially because you are fighting in your core regions. This is a true civil war. The garrison of Mediolanum that fought so many battles for you back in the early days is now out on the field under the SPQR banner, and your loyal 9th Legion who fought at their side so many times is forced to turn their sword on their own brothers. I hope it will give the feeling of wastefulness of a civil war, that every victory is hollow because 4,000 enemies killed is 4,000 of your own men no longer available once the war ends, a feeling only possible because of the whole military-age population mechanic discussed earlier. I think that's how a Total War Civil War event is done right, and that this will be a far cry from Rome 2's jarring Civil War mechanics. The way it would play out would be quite similar to the Mass Rebellion, with first the player venturing into lost regions with loyal forces. But they won't be looking for field armies, they will head right to the settlement, because this time it's the government itself you need to fight. So instead of lots of field battles on the Mass Rebellion, here you'll face lots of siege battles from the offset. You will need to secure each region capital, and ones that you outclass militarily will surrender to you when you arrive. But really it's a race, as armies are being trained in every settlement you aren't retaking, so after 2 turns surrenders probably won't happen, and instead you'll need to assault your own defences to get the job done. This will be made extra hard by the fact that playing a campaign that pleases the people but angers the state means having a small military and spending lots on settlement upgrades needed earlier in the campaign so your small military can still beat invading armies. But now they are a thorn in your side, as all the extra towers you built around Capua are raining bolts onto your creeping testudo columns. Additionally, the battles will be a little different, as both armies will always have low integrity, not being too pumped for a civil war scenario. So this will probably provide a different feel to the battles you experience for most of the campaign, as now armies tend to have lower morale than usual. That means your standard go-to tactics you've been playing with might now fall apart as your front line refuses to accept attack orders, or your cavalry just give up the fight the moment the enemy present a shield wall against them. If you can't secure everything in a few turns, then the Coup faction will go on the offensive, and field battles will become more common again. But the Coup armies will be aiming not to engage your armies, but to seize power. They will primarily try to take settlements, with a focus on taking the capital of your faction if that wasn't already part of the Coup's territory. If you can find victory, you will have proven your point, and the state support for your political circle will shoot up, which might cause you to win the campaign if you've already met a victory condition, in this case probably an economic victory. You killed a lot of your own people, maybe some of your own generals, but the result is a unified faction, so perhaps the future security that provides will make it all worth it. So with the Mass Rebellion and Political Coup, you have 2 different late-game challenges that will occur under different circumstances. The great thing about having the different trigger conditions is that it caters to entirely different playstyles, aggressive for the Mass Rebellion and economic for the Political Coup. It even adds in a touch of a morality roleplay system, for if you are relentless in the use of your own people for your gain, you'll get lots of rewards but face that Mass Rebellion. Maybe you don't give a damn because you're fine with killing barbarians, but if you try to build a faction that exists for the sake of its common people, it will tragically be those common people who have to be killed to stop their upper-class puppet masters from ending your benevolent regime, unless you are a true Sun Tzu disciple and can find a way to do it without killing them. The 2 events are very much different ends of the military focus versus civil focus approaches, with each one being virtually guaranteed to happen at either end of the scale. But what about the middle path? If you balance popular and state support and end up with not a large or small amount of either, you're playing a game of chance. You will still get a mass rebellion, but with high public order across the board it will be less bad. But if a mass rebellion occurs and the conditions for a political coup are nearly met, a coup will occur at the same time, and vice versa. But they will be smaller versions of the events since the levels of antagonism are lower. So you might have only 10 regions rebel and 10 join SPQR instead of 20 rebelling or 20 supporting the coup. It would be a pure mix, with the fact the events trigger together ensuring that this middle way isn't a get-out card, but I think it should be overall a little easier to deal with than the result of more extreme ruling styles. There may even be unique ruling styles that lead to medium popular support and high state support, so you have a small rebellion but no coup, so pro players may be able to find this balance to optimize their chances. It would also be the case that different factions may be more or less likely to see one or the other event. Perhaps Rome, with its semblance of democracy, gets state support easier as they aren't so ostracized from power as in a monarchy. Maybe people don't like living under the rule of nomadic overlords, so are more likely to rebel against them. In some ways, these predispositions would be a key factor in determining the difficulty of a campaign. But these factors might not be tied to the factions per se, more to the government type a faction has. And that leads me on to the next point. Faction types and policies. In short, Rome 3 would have the ability for a faction to change its type. So, for example, your Celtic tribe may switch from an oligarchy-type faction ruled by its elders to a monarchy-type faction ruled by a king. This is something that your king and political circle can choose to do if the preconditions for a change are met. And in most cases, the change is going to require that your faction leader and his allies have an absolute ton of gravitas, especially for big changes. Say you're playing as Rome and decide you're going to switch from a republic to a monarchy in order to start the Roman Empire. If your faction leader is insanely famous and powerful, you can expend your gravitas and lots of money, of course, to make the changes. You would likely also take public order hits and have big hits to your support levels. So why do this at all? To change the passive bonuses that different faction types bring. To stop this from being complicated, it would essentially be like the power bar in Attila, where you could go from being barely involved in the lives of your people at all to controlling everything. The different faction types will just sit on a linear scale, measuring how many different people wield power. At one end is the anarchic tribal system, every village for itself, and at the other end is the cult of personality monarchy, where the people must bow down to you, their god emperor. Like in Attila, each notch on the scale would come with a number of different effects on your faction, and the point of being able to change is to transition into a new set of bonuses to suit your plans. Perhaps being at the anarchy end of the scale makes your private building slots develop faster and makes it easy to improve public order, while being at the dictator end makes it easier to raise troops and develop state building slots. But one thing that will make it more than just a passive bonus is the fact that your government type affects what kinds of technologies you can research. Technologies will be discussed more later, but the basic idea is that some developments will only be possible through having either a very open or very closed society, so that could add further motivation to make your change. For example, maybe a really free society can't research conscription, and thus is stuck with a limited number of recruitment slots. But a really authoritarian society can't research democracy, making it hard for them to gain support. How all this balances out would be key to whether this is a good idea or not, but I'll just leave it here as a good idea to investigate. As for making changes from one notch to the other, the more notches on the faction type scale you want to change your faction by, the more expensive it will be. It may also trigger a loyalty check on your generals, with disloyal ones having a chance to rebel in opposition to the change. Overall, the faction type will be something it is possible to ignore, but to really optimize your experience you'll want to give it some thought, similar to the politics of Attila. I don't want it to be crucial, because a decent portion of players might not care at all, so I want it to still be feasible to play as any faction type. The other faction-wide mechanic new to Rome 3 will be faction policies. Now, this isn't actually entirely new, as it is a logical extension of the edict system from Rome 2. A faction policy is basically an edict that takes effect across all of your regions, and isn't limited to just being one thing. Examples of policies might be censorship, conscription, tax breaks for the poor, tax breaks for the rich, tariffs on imported goods, mandatory worship of all your faction's gods. All of these things having positive and negative effects that you are meant to use to complement whatever you're doing with your faction. So you might deploy censorship to reduce the rate of decline of public order across the whole faction, but at the cost of economic or technological growth. The number of faction policies you can do at once will depend on the faction type, which is important because it means that when you transition to a type that is supposedly more controlling, like from an elected chiefdom to a hereditary kingdom, you as a player actually gain more control over your faction. This is a way to create immersion in the importance of the change through actual game mechanics, not just text or imagination. And I think that cases where a game's own mechanics evoke the themes and idea of the thing they are meant to be simulating are when hardcore mechanics fans like me really get into things. The same lust for power, making real rulers change their governments, will be in some way driving you as a player to make the same decision, which will be awesome if it all works out how I hope. As a side note, I think I've heard Total Biscuit calling this idea thematic mechanical abstraction, if you'd like a name for that design strategy. The faction policy choices you have available will be tied to a number of factors, most importantly technology, faction type, and culture. It is also likely that some policies would only be available when you have a lot of public or state support, encouraging you to build your people's trust so you could exploit that trust in some useful way. Technology and research. I think, since we're hovering close to the issue, it's time to talk about how technology works in Rome 3. In the most basic sense, the technology mechanic will be based on Rome 2, insofar as you have a tech tree available and can choose things to research. That's probably about where the similarities end, though. There are two major differences to the Rome 3 tech tree, and both of those differences are lifted right from other Total War games, so hopefully this will be easy to follow. One is the concept of technological tiers, another the concept of researching multiple things at once. The tier system has a lot of ramifications, so I'll talk about that first. A tiered technology system was done in Shogun 2 Fall of the Samurai. There you had a faction-wide pool of development points, and if you got enough, you'd unlock a whole new tier of technologies to research. You got them by broadly investing in modern infrastructure across your domain, which came with penalties to public order, usually stopping you from jumping up the tech tree fast unless you also conquered new regions to spread the load over. In Rome 3, I want to have the ancient world equivalent of this. You might have, say, 6 tiers of tech, each requiring a more sophisticated society to study. This is the exact opposite of how Rome 2 worked, where you could go down one branch of the tech tree right to the end from the very beginning. That's kind of appealing in a let the player do whatever they want kind of way, but I'll explain in a moment why I think a tier system can in practice allow greater freedom. First though, I'll give it a more practical justification. In real life, technological development is not a tree, but a crazily intertwined net where things from unrelated fields are combined by innovators to create new theories or devices. As an ancient world example, you won't find yourself building fountains in your towns without already having some understanding of stoneworking, hydraulics, city planning, metal casting. Basically, each new tech comes off the back of loads of others. In a tech tree, this would be silly to implement, as there would be too many connections and prerequisites for everything. Instead, the tier system is a broad and rough way of saying that you need a certain amount of existing knowledge before your people would even be able to think about technologies that are more advanced in paradigm sense. And the system from Fall of the Samurai does pretty much that. So certain buildings would influence some kind of development score. When it hits the right amount, the next tier would unlock, and provided you'd researched any things required in the tier below, you'd be able to get new techs available to research. Your faction type would be a big contributor to how many development points you have, as will the construction of libraries, workshops, civil administration buildings, anything that might plausibly cause knowledge to pool within collections of learned individuals. As also noted earlier, the faction type will make certain technologies unavailable, although a reasonable and useful progression will be possible for all types. Changing the type will be for more micromanaging players who want to grab as much of the tree as possible. Now for why I think the tier system will bring more freedom for players. The reason is because with this system, the technology tree doesn't have to be unique to each faction, and all factions can in principle have access to any technology. The tier system means that the advanced architectural technologies of the Romans can still be in the tree for the Picts. They will just be in tier 4, while Picts begin with only tier 1 available. Conversely, Rome will start with tier 4 available and have all the little tier 1 techs that they would have already picked up in their early days as a tiny kingdom already researched. This setup gives a couple of nice advantages design-wise. One is that players of less advanced factions can see the path to greatness there and have a way to actually achieve it, not limited by where they started from, as long as they can actually build their faction into one that would plausibly be able to pull itself up like that, which in real terms means getting enough development points. That is the source of the freedom I'm touting, that any faction can, in principle, become similar to any other faction in terms of techs available. The tech tree would essentially be really big and contain everything in the scope of the ancient world, and different factions would just be in different parts, rather than Rome 2's system where they all had their own tech trees that didn't overlap. I think that being able to look at this big tree and see that up there lies segmented plate armor, regardless of whether your faction even knows about metalworking, would help the player roleplay their faction's journey and plan a custom research strategy that could be different for each playthrough, much more so than in Rome 2. Another advantage to this design is that it helps fight the problem of how factions who start powerful stay powerful. In Rome 2, a common problem is that factions with an initial advantage don't seem to get anywhere with it. The issue was that the game gives all factions a lump sum of money every turn, regardless of size. So the 1 region faction gets 5,000 per turn for free, and the 10 region Roman Republic also gets 5,000, plus the income from those regions, which might bring it up to say 8,000. So despite being 10 times the size, Rome is only slightly better able to field armies from that money than some nobody from the mountains. These numbers were made up, but in principle I think that was the root of the issue, with Rome in particular almost always disappearing early in the game if you didn't play as them. Other massive factions like Carthage, Egypt, and the Seleucids had the same issue, leading to cases where players are left scratching their heads over how the Carthaginian Empire was lost to a random invasion by Athens. To be fair, the campaign AI might also be a big part of this strangeness, but that's a barrel of fish for later in our discussion. In this tech system, the big factions actually start with a very real advantage. They were big because their cultures, their societies, were more productive than others, having better bureaucracies, more efficient governments or legal systems, and having access early on to key technologies like writing, road building, and massed military tactics. These factions have already become relatively advanced, and this will be represented by them having the lower orders of the tech tree already researched, bringing with that access to better units and an assortment of passive bonuses that will make them legitimately superior to their neighbours. With this, if you play as the Picts and try to conquer your way into Europe, you're much more likely to find it controlled by Rome or Carthage than a Lusitani tribe. But of course, it's still not a guarantee, anything can happen. It's just more likely that big factions will keep getting bigger until they fight each other, as you'd expect. Some might say it's more interesting to have random factions taking over everything because it means you're likely to face different opponents with each campaign. But I think that's outweighed by the desire from less long-term players to face off against the famous factions, especially as those factions probably have all the high-end unique units, providing both more challenging and historically interesting battles. So yes, hopefully by modelling the prior advancement of factions in this way, the path of history will continue in a slightly more reliable way, until the player steps in to knock it off course, that is. As for what all the technologies actually are, that's a very deep question that we should probably avoid here. The design is really the tip of the iceberg of the tech tree. How it's balanced will be the make or break factor for this feature. Let's just brush over that for now and go on to the second of the 2 major differences with the tech system from Rome 2, this time a more basic one. The way in which technologies are actually researched will, in short, be taken from Empire Total War rather than Rome 2. Rome 2 is very simple and easy to use, researching one thing at a time, and your research buildings just generating points to make that research take fewer turns. But I think it is more interesting and makes more sense in the game world to use Empire's system, where you have a list of the buildings that can actively research things, universities in that context, and each one can be set to research something different. This makes sense to me, especially for the ancient world where technological advancement isn't done in unity between people within a faction, it's just done randomly all over the place by whoever the thing in question is relevant to. Having one research at a time is a nice simplification, but I think we can afford the complexity of allowing multiple researchers at once. But I'll still keep it so simple as to not make sense in the real world, just to continue the trend. I'm thinking that research will be directed by relevant buildings in your state-owned building slots. That means if I have 2 regions, and in one I've got a state-owned engineering workshop, and in the other a state-owned library, I can research 2 techs at once from the tree, with us imagining that one institution worked on each. You could make things more detailed by saying that an engineering workshop can only research engineering-related techs, that sort of thing. This may well happen, but right now, with the detail of the tech tree still up for debate, I won't commit to that. But the room is certainly there, with Empire and Napoleon providing good examples of different types of technologies needing different types of buildings. But unlike in Empire, where you assign each building to each tech to research, here would be a streamlined approach, where you're just allowed to pick the number of things on the tech tree that matches your research center count, the actual detail of who went and researched each thing being abstracted away for simplicity. Another difference to Empire, and another simplification, is that if you have lots of research buildings and don't research enough stuff to have them all be busy, it will just speed up the researches you do have going rather than doing nothing. The mixing won't be perfect. So for example, if I have 2 buildings and research only one thing, then it researches at, say, 150% speed, not 200% speed. This encourages you to micro the research a little, but still helps even if you can't be bothered. More interestingly, it lets you tactically make your long-term tech growth suboptimal in order to get certain specific techs really quickly, which then makes the research distribution a part of your overall strategic choices for added depth. The base research speed would be based on the combined research points generated by all buildings in your faction, both private and public. So while only your state-owned buildings define how many researchers you do at once, the research points generated by anything the people have built in their many private building slots will contribute to your overall pool. So you can think of it as your state institutions taking all the techniques and knowledge your people can provide and focusing them together to create something new, which I think is a decent way of modelling how state-led research in the ancient world would work. Spies and information gathering. Now I think it's time we went away from big-scale campaign mechanics and talked once again about things happening on a turn-by-turn basis. I'm going to talk now about spies, and how in general the player will get information about what is going on beyond the borders of their regions. In Rome 2, the spy or scout was an agent with a tight limit on how many you could have, but an extremely broad and powerful set of abilities that made them ridiculously potent, destroying whole armies in a couple of turns with their famous poison provisions ability. For Rome 3, we'll be going back towards the Rome 1 style spying system, meaning you can have lots of spies, but they aren't superheroes, usually just able to give you information on something, with the amount of information varying based on how good they are. I did quite like the Shogun 2-agent system, where each agent was a hard counter to another, and they had quite specific abilities, but could always also be used for passive buffs if you didn't want to micro them or spend money on operations. So, I'll be taking a few pages from that, but overall in Rome 3, the role of agents will be downplayed. Right now I'll just talk about the spy, as that is the one that will be working most differently, and then we'll discuss in a later section what other agents you'll have available. First of all, there won't be a hard limit on how many spies you can recruit. They will have a clearly displayed upkeep cost though, and that cost will vary based on what they're doing. So there will be a soft limit based on how many you can afford, and indeed how many you actually need, since there is a limit to the usefulness of being able to see the entire world map at once. A spy won't be so much of a character as in Rome 2, not being a giant marker on the campaign map, not having a big leveling tree to micromanage, and not being a superhero of any kind, not individually important to the campaign. Instead, it is the information itself that is important, and that will be made the case by the fact that information will be dramatically limited compared to Rome 2. For example, in Rome 2, when an enemy army came into your lands, you could see its composition down to the last man, knowing the precise number of troops, the experience of each unit, their individual stats, and how their general and equipment was altering those stats. Basically, you got the same level of information you have on your own armies, unless the enemy was right on the edge of your line of sight, in which case you often knew almost nothing. For Rome 3, you will by default know only broad facts about enemy armies. If an army appears from the fog of war and parks itself in your lands, you would plausibly be able to get information on its vague size from the common people. So you are shown an army marker with all the figures darkened like shadows, the general and unit captains behind him, with a number of unit captains telling you how big the army was, but nothing of its composition. To be kind, you'll always know what faction the army belongs to, but you won't know who the general is or anything about him. So all you can do is roughly estimate the army size from the unit scale, and estimate composition from anything you know about the faction, perhaps checking the encyclopedia to remind yourself of what to expect. For every turn the army stays in your lands, you would learn more info as reports from the people and your low-level patrols come back, giving you info on what units are in the army, the name of the general, perhaps knowledge of the experience level of certain units. But you still wouldn't know everything, and certainly wouldn't have the actual stats of their units available. To get the full picture, and of course to have the full picture on the first turn of the invasion, which is when it is really useful, you send a spy to infiltrate the army. This will be like in Rome 1, where a spy actually goes into the enemy army and stays there until either you order him to leave or he gets uncovered. The spy will be, in most cases, the difference between knowing everything and knowing little to nothing. The spies themselves will be easy and cheap to recruit, being recruitable from either a settlement or a general, and will upon recruitment be allowed to move right away rather than waiting for the next term. So an example of use. You might have an army walk up to an enemy border with 3 spies in it already. You send one out to look for enemy forts or armies and find 2. You send your other 2 spies into these, and then recruit a new one into the army to be a counter-spy, with your original spy going to look at the region's main settlement. You probably wouldn't be this careful with your intelligence gathering all the time. This is what you would do if you wanted to know everything before committing to a move with your army, the safe approach. The overall mood with the spy system is that they are numerous and disposable. However, they would still be named agents with experience levels like in Rome 1. You just wouldn't micromanage their skills like in Rome 2, and they wouldn't have so many different actions. Their basic actions, since we're on the topic, would just be spy and counter-spy. When spying, if they are in an enemy settlement, you get a line of sight into that region, and line of sight on the roads of all adjoining regions. When counter-spying in your own settlement, you also get that line of sight on the roads of adjoining regions, but it also gives you a much higher chance of seeing enemy spies in the region, be they in the settlement, armies, or just out in the open. And of course, when spying on enemy armies or agents, you get details on them the same as the details you'd get on your own stuff. It's a system that is mechanically simpler and very similar actually to how shinobi were used in Shogun 1, just straight up spies and counter-spies. The slight complexity is that, like in Rome 2, the spy is also equipped with special abilities, but this isn't a case of running up to an army and killing the commander. While your spy is in an army or settlement, he gathers trust, something represented by a little number on the interface. Once you successfully get a spy into an army, you can use that spy to conduct operations like poisoning, misdirection, and assassination. But in Rome 3, you need to build up trust to do this, and that means you have to have the spy embedded in the army for a while before making the move. The bigger the action, the more trust is needed. So killing the commander might be something you need to work up to for a while, but if you wanted to remove the upgraded equipment from a single unit, maybe your spy could manage that early on in his sneaky campaign. Failing an agent action causes the spy to lose trust, and if the trust falls to 0 or below, he is discovered, after which he either dies or escapes, just like in Shogun 2. There won't be a wounded state. If he escaped with a wound, then it obviously wasn't enough to hinder his escape from the mobs of soldiers, so in that case it isn't enough to justify him not being able to act again on the campaign map. This trust-building system means that although spies still have access to some fun and powerful abilities, they can only use them after a plausible build-up, which will make them much less overpowered compared to Rome 2. One thing I should add is that the trust system is quite abstract and covers just general trust among the population of the spy's target. So when in a settlement, the trust they build can be used to do everything. They don't specifically need to have trust from the governor to kill him, separate to the trust from the spy of another faction to expose him. It's just a metric used to decide what actions are available at a particular time. For counter-spying, having a spy in a friendly army makes the trust of enemy spies in the army decline based on the level of your counter-spy. So say you have a level 5 spy in your army counter-spying. The enemy infiltrate a level 3 spy. As a basic example, let's say that means the enemy spy gains 3 trust per turn, while your counter-spy removes 5 trust per turn. If spies start with, say, 10 trust once they're in, you will discover that spy after 2 turns. But if the enemy then brings in a level 7 spy, they will still gain 2 trust per turn, and will eventually gain an action to assassinate your own spy. So when your level 9 spy suddenly dies within your main force and you can't tell why, you probably have a slight issue of a level 10 spy being deeply embedded in the army. He's probably the general's personal servant by now. In order to make it so that spies can't get embedded in armies forever, with trust never dropping because you can't manage to get a level 10 spy of your own to send it down, you would be able to counter-spy with more than one spy and have their combined level be the trust reduction. So sending in 2 level 6 spies would slowly remove all the options for a level 10 spy until he's either discovered, or if the AI is paying attention, he's removed from the army and sent off elsewhere. I think it would be fair that when a spy flees a mission like this, and you have a higher counter-spy level, you would get the concession of seeing where the enemy spy went so that you could pursue them, rather than them just disappearing entirely only to infiltrate the army again with a false moustache a few turns later. You could argue for a system where the same spy can't infiltrate the same place twice, since he is a suspect agent after fleeing the first time, but I think that would be too much detail for this feature. One little point to mention is that since you will have lots of spies, you will be able to move lots at once, just like units. So you could select the cards for your 4 spies in one settlement and move them all over to the next one because you suspect the reason the private building slots keep getting damaged is because someone is up to no good and you want it over fast. You can basically have spy stacks, if you like, moving them around in groups and then splitting them up to do lots of things at once as needed, just like with units. I think it won't add too much complexity to the game, especially as not using them at all or barely at all will be an option on lower difficulties. Oh, and one more point to mention will be the importance of having a spy in an army that you are attacking, as having a man on the inside will reveal, when it comes to battles, unique information that will be extremely valuable, especially to new players. I'll talk about this later when I cover how the opening scenes of battles work. Campaign line of sight and unseen routes. In Rome 3, line of sight, and more broadly what information you have on the situation in enemy regions, will be of heightened importance. Like in Rome 2 and all Total War games, armies will automatically scout the area around them, giving them a line of sight. This line of sight will be smaller than in Rome 2 because I don't want to have the situation where as you walk into an enemy region you see everything in it because the line of sight is so far. I want it to be the case that while in one half of a region, you can't see what's in the other half without sending spies or a detached army, adding to the tension when attacking and the depth of your defense when defending. You will also have a very small line of sight around enemy armies that you have spies inside, plus the line of sight on the roads between settlements where you have a spy operating at one of the ends. Inside your own regions, you will have line of sight everywhere to represent how your own people and administration would report information on any invading forces they discover. The exceptions to this will be when regions contain forests or mountainous areas that are not populated. These areas remain dark unless you scout them, and are what I refer to as unseen routes. Of course, the implication is immediate, that if an army moved through these parts of a region, it can get in without being noticed. Unlike in Rome 2, where things like forests and mountains often presented impassable barriers, in Rome 3 they will sometimes be passable but with dramatically reduced speed, perhaps giving you only 25% of your movement points. This is an important part of deepening the campaign strategy, offering a viable alternative to the current go-to strategy of just walking up the main road to a settlement and fighting anyone who shows up to stop you. This gives you the chance for a sneak attack, hitting a settlement that is protected behind a fort on the road near the border. This is in effect the game's counter-strategy to fortifying the main routes. You take the unseen routes that the factions can't usually see. The comedy starts when you move through an unseen route and discover the enemy are doing the same thing. If you want, you can choose to engage an army if you find it, but the battlefields you get will be very difficult. The mountainous ones are full of cliffs, uneven terrain, and impassable rocks. The forest ones are full of impassably dense patches and otherwise almost total tree cover, meaning all the units move slowly and are hidden most of the time. You might know the enemy army is there somewhere, but where specifically might be so annoying to find out that in these battles you could be better off just retreating to the edge of the unseen route so you can just ambush the enemy once they come out. In some parts of the map, like Germania, you'll have patchworks of forest and roads, meaning that you can have hidden armies all over the place if you like. Factions in places like Germania and Britannia would have extra campaign movement range when taking armies through forests to represent their increased familiarity with the move. There will be truly impassable bits of the map, some really deep forests or harsh mountains, plus rivers and seas of course, so it won't be total freedom in terms of movement, but more freedom. So in general, the arrangement of campaign line of sight being smaller, and there being more places to hide armies, will lead to a little more strategic depth, with scouting being more important and rapid attacks being a more risky, intense move. To give you an idea of how far a standard army would be able to see, it will be roughly equal to the size of the army's zone of control, unless it has been upgraded in some way. That means it will be the case that if you attack an army, and it has another army on the edge of its reinforcement range behind it, you won't be able to see that army and will be surprised by it on the battlefield. That's right, hidden backup armies won't reveal themselves on the pre-battle screen. They just show up on the field to make it a strategic ambush, a much more harrowing experience. We'll talk more about how reinforcements will work later on though. Other agents. Now with Spies covered, let's cover the rest of the agent mechanics in Rome 3. There are 2 other agents you can recruit, but both are much less important than the Spies, with less they can do and with less management required. In general, I should say, I always found agents in campaigns to be a sideshow that was made relevant only by the fact that single agents were so powerful in affecting armies. Here in Rome 3, agents will have a much more subdued and realistic role, optimizing your performance rather than defining it entirely. The 2 other agents are veteran officers and statesmen. The veteran officer is the easiest one to explain. It would basically be a stripped down equivalent of the foreign veteran in Fall of the Samurai or the champion in Rome 2. As I mentioned, they are a passive agent with minimal management required. Either you hire them to sit in a recruitment region to provide additional experience to recruits, or you embed them in an army to give a gradual experience gain over time, and perhaps other small passive bonuses like movement range buffs or higher baseline integrity. They will be cheap to recruit, comparable to a single unit, and will be recruitable in any region with a military recruitment building. The only real management I think you'll need to do with them is to move them out of settlements that aren't recruiting anymore and into armies, so sitting the agent in a settlement that isn't recruiting will be a waste of their upkeep. Like the spy, the veteran will level up over time, so you're encouraged to keep them clear of assassins. However, unlike the spy, there will be a hard limit to how many you can have at once. This is because with agents that provide constant passive advantages, you don't want to feel like you might as well have them in every single army, in which case there's almost no point having an agent system at all, might as well just have it so all armies are assumed to have veterans training them. To make it an actual interactive and tactical mechanic, you need to choose which armies or settlements are getting special treatment. Because of this, the limit on veterans will be 1 per military recruitment building in your empire. The statesman is mechanically similar, but will only act in settlements. They are a really easy agent, either improving your own economic efficiency and public order in your own settlements, or increasing your faction's relationship with the owning faction if it's someone else's. The second effect is the one I hope they will be most useful for. basically expending your money per turn in their upkeep to make sure the faction's opinion of you doesn't drop too low. So yes, the Statesman is very simple, and like the Veteran is limited purely to add a strategic element of deciding what to use them for. The Statesman limit would be tied to the level of the main city administration building in the capital region for each province. So for example, if you have 2 provinces, and note I mean provinces not regions, so 2 provinces might mean 7 regions, and with those 2 provinces, one's capital has level 1 building and the other one is a level 2 building, your statesman limit would be 3. One little subtlety though is that your statesmen are only recruited from your faction capital. The only reason behind this is to increase the time spent moving to the lands of other factions, giving them a chance to be picked up by enemy spies, and of course letting you do the same with the statesmen of your rivals. Statesmen would be quite easy to assassinate for your spies, needing only a small amount of trust, so they will make great training projects, and of course killing statesmen will stop your rivals from gaining superior relations with other factions, which may prevent important alliances from forming. Now, I was considering adding another agent, some kind of priest or missionary agent that would spread your religion to regions, but I thought that wasn't really interesting enough as a game mechanic to bother having an agent for it. And the idea of the state recruiting individual priests to spread religion seems strange. Spread of religion will instead be controllable by provincial edicts and faction policies, plus the use of religious buildings, of course. I kind of like the idea of using priests to spread your religion to rival regions, but I also think the spread of religion is something done on a more grand scale, not so influenced by the acts of individuals, so maybe it's more suited to political mechanics, not agent mechanics. Who knows, maybe the priest will make it into Rome 3 before release. With all agents, the cost emphasis is on upkeep cost rather than recruitment cost like in Rome 2. If they just cost a lot up front but are then free, the only difference it makes is whether you upgrade a building this turn or next turn, which in the grand scheme of things doesn't matter, so recruiting agents is basically always a good idea. By giving them an upkeep cost and a low recruitment cost, there is an ongoing advantage to not using agents, since you get an extra unit or 2 in your armies permanently. So in this way, the choice to use agents is actually a strategic choice, with both options being viable, slightly enhancing the variety of approaches available, and of course, allowing for people who just don't care about agents and just want to use armies for everything to do just that without being explicitly punished for it. Some campaign parameters. We've already gone through a lot of advanced points about the campaign, but now I want to bring in a quick mention of what are actually the most important campaign parameters. First, let's discuss turns per year and army movement ranges. For reference, Rome 2 is 1 turn per year, with movement distances that allow armies to move from settlement to settlement or very close by in a single turn. The 2 quick criticisms of these parameters are that 1 turn per year means characters die too quickly, and being able to move from settlement to settlement means that most battles are sieges or siege sallies, and that maneuver of armies is just not a factor in campaign planning, as you can usually just go right for the jugular. So for Rome 3, we're coming in with some quick fixes. First, the campaign is 12 turns per year, and movement ranges will be balanced to take about 2 turns of movement to move from settlement to settlement. Note that these movement ranges won't be historical. Each turn would be a month, and an army can move quite far in a month, a few hundred miles at a steady pace with good supplies. So unless there are very few settlements on the map, this isn't really going to be accurate. It is a choice made entirely for gameplay reasons, making it so that in general, an army attacking you will be seen en route before it sieges you, to give you a chance to use campaign strategy to strengthen your position before a battle takes place, or go in for a field battle, which would be a great option as your people probably aren't going to be happy with battles taking place inside their settlements. It should tackle complaints about the most recent games that siege battles, which of course didn't fully work with the AI, were the most common engagement, or more specifically, auto-resolved siege battles, since settlements are rarely defended by armies. The 12 turns per year will be over 4 seasons with the different weather effects for each, as in Shogun 2, and different probabilities of seeing various weathers in battles. The 4-turn winter will create a natural down period like that of Fall of the Samurai, where it is harder to go on the offensive, giving an excuse to spend money on civil development and upgrade your forces. But we'll talk about the whole concept of wintering in Rome 3 later, as that will be a fairly important part of the game. And if 12 turns per year isn't your bag, remember that turns per year is a nice, easy thing to mod, so in reality you'll be able to play with whatever turn per year count you want, but the campaign will be balanced for 12 turns per year. The next parameter to consider is the number of regions on the map, or the total number of settlements available for factions to control. What this number is partially depends on the technology. If we want to have movement ranges be roughly half the average distance between settlements, then having large numbers of settlements means we also need to have a fine scale on the campaign map to stop the movement ranges being too small to manage. So it's hard to settle on a number. The direction is up, though, so more than Rome 2, the more the merrier, perhaps aiming to get something like 250 settlements into the game. A related topic is how many of these settlements you need to win the game. Well, I think that having a settlement count isn't really the way to go. I think the grand victory condition should be a more practical one, that being that you are without rivals in the rest of the world. So you win when you as a faction have grown enough that no diplomatically plausible combination of the other factions is likely to stop you. I imagine this would involve between a third and half of the regions, taking into account that many regions might not be worth much, so the factions controlling them don't add much to the strength of the pool of potential enemies. By diplomatically plausible, I mean that factions who are your close allies won't be counted as being potential enemies. So you might be able to win if you conquer a third of the world, an ally somehow you've remained really close with does the same, and then the remaining third of the world is internally warring, so can't plausibly ally against you. As mentioned earlier, the conditions would also involve having a certain amount of state and public support, which clearing the rebellion or coup events will provide if you couldn't keep it together. Of course, you'd have lots of different victory types, so there would be one for controlling 80% of the whole map as a domination victory, and a short victory condition where you just need to establish yourself as a power that seems like it would be a contender for campaign winner without actually having to go and do the legwork of making it happen. Perhaps you just need to be one of the top 5 factions while controlling at least 20 regions, 2 things that will usually come hand in hand. The short campaign condition is crucial, providing a goal that can be reached in a few gameplay sessions, aimed at people who aren't really that into the game or into that particular faction, and are just doing it to pass some time, not wishing to get into the repetitive mid to late game experiences that usually arise from strategy game situations where you are winning. In principle, having your victory condition depend on yourself being powerful in comparison to others gives some incentive to take part in international politics to keep other up-and-coming factions down, arranging peace deals or war declarations to try and manipulate their growth. If you don't care about all that, you can always just go and kill them all, that's great. Or if you don't care about killing, you can just try to be in a big multi-faction alliance that will collectively give you the victory condition. Another important parameter is how large settlement garrisons are, as that defines whether you can easily take a region with an army in a single turn or not. Since this is a big topic, let's transition into a new section to cover just that. Settlement garrisons. Rome 3's garrisons will in general be bigger than Rome 2's, but of course since we have the concept of military population, they will work a little differently. The maximum size of the garrison depends on how many military-age population people you have. Having specific buildings will add special units to the garrison, but those units are still taken from the military population. So for example, a standard town settlement might have a military-age population of around 1,000. Let's assume the player hasn't recruited them all and marched them all off somewhere, so they will all join the garrison army when the enemy approaches. If there are no buildings at all that add special units to the garrison, you'll end up with a mix of generic local Spies or town watch type units, with basic equipment and some of them having no equipment and just being mob units. But if you actually had a barracks in the settlement, maybe that gives you the ability to have 4 units of Hastati and 2 of Principes in the garrison. For simplicity, let's say there are 100 men per unit in this example, so the garrison becomes 400 hastati, 200 principes, and then perhaps 200 shield and spear-armed town watch or riarii, whatever they are technically called, and 200 mob with light javelins and mixed low-quality melee weapons. Buildings in the private building slots, like workshops, may provide an extra unit or two of heavy infantry to represent the presence of extra equipment and equipment-making facilities that allows people to prepare for battle more effectively. So really, to answer the question of whether a generic army can overcome a generic garrison with ease, we are led to the answer of maybe. The broad answer is going to be that undeveloped settlements won't be able to field much, while if you attack Rome with 5,000 men, you might find that an army of 20,000 appears inside, so you'll need to rethink your plan. With the whole sieges and garrisons topic, it is essential to add in a new feature in order to complement the concept of the population being people you don't want to lose. This feature is the ability to surrender when under siege at any time, for both the player and the AI. This feature is both very grounded in real historical strategy and needed to preserve population when fighting an invading army would be so costly that even if you managed to win, the settlement would be in trouble. So let's imagine that as Rome, you have a town in southern Gaul. Let's say it's Tolosa. It has a population of 17,000 and a military-age population of about 1,500. Used to be more, but you raised a few companies of Gallic auxiliaries from it last year and it hasn't recovered yet. Suddenly an Arverni army appears from the west, with you having neglected to send spies out to locate their main force. They besiege Tolosa with an army of 5,000 men, with you knowing virtually nothing of its composition. They are attacking at once and you are looking at a very difficult battle. But you know that the 3rd Legion in Massalia has 3,000 heavy infantry, probably enough to defeat this invader in open battle in a couple of turns' time. So you click where the retreat option usually is, now showing a surrender button. The Arverni immediately make their decision as to what to do with the settlement, and luckily for you, they occupy it. You didn't lose your population, and that means if you come back in a few turns and destroy the Arverni military, you can get Tolosa back all intact. In Rome too, that scenario would be just auto-resolving the fight, losing the 1,500 men, and you'd find that when you returned to recapture the settlement they had respawned. No hint of the fact that actual people lived there had been very recently slaughtered. Now the stakes are higher and the options greater. You are taking a risk in surrendering, for what if the other faction just enslaves the population and then leaves? Now you're in even worse trouble. I'll talk more about slaves in the next section to give some hints on what you might try to do in this case. But sticking to garrisons, there is another common issue people take with garrison armies that Rome 3 will try to address. Back in our example, say the player attacked Tolosa immediately after it had fallen, triggering a siege battle. Now the garrison would be fighting for the Arverni, which is a little jarring if just a moment ago they seemed willing to lay down their lives to keep these invaders out. Clearly there needs to be some factor that determines just how many people actually oppose the invading army. In Rome too, that was handled nicely because the garrison was always dead when you took the settlement, so needed to replenish for a while before being effective. But in Rome 3, where manpower is not infinite, we need a deeper system. To start with, you always get half your military population in a garrison army, representing how people in the ancient world always try to resist invasion, because 99% of the time, invasions come with a certain amount of rape and pillage. That was half the reason soldiers bothered to join the army in the first place. So there's always something to gain by repelling any enemy, regardless of who they are. How much of the remaining 50% you will get will depend on a mix of your faction's popular support, the public order in the region, and the amount of the population that matches the culture of the attacking faction. In our example, say Tolosa is actually 40% Celtic, Celtic being the culture of the Arverni people. Perhaps we would be limited to getting only 80% of the military population into the garrison. How all this is balanced precisely is probably something to decide once it's in place and the game goes through alpha testing, so we'll ignore that for now. One other factor to keep in mind with garrisons of recently captured settlements is that if the settlement still has the buildings of the old owner, they might not be providing as many special garrison units, but it won't be none at all. Because I think it would be damn cool if the Arverni invaders still got 1 or 2 units of Hastati or Principes in their garrison from having a Roman barracks, representing men forced to fight for their new masters. Perhaps they would have a morale penalty for having to fight for a faction they aren't native to, but the point is that they are there. For a Roman player, that will increase the feeling that if they stoop to fighting a garrison from one of their recently lost settlements, they are fighting their own troops effectively. A nice example of a ruler bonus your faction could get is one that encourages the assimilation of other factions' units, allowing you to get bigger special garrisons from foreign buildings. Anyway, that whole example was just to show that having the option to surrender makes logical sense for a commander wanting to focus on their long-term prosperity, which hopefully will be most. For settlements that come under siege and don't surrender for a while, they will rapidly lose population to lack of supplies, and the player must ruthlessly calculate if it's worth letting 3,000 more people die in order to keep the enemy locked into a siege while your forces approach, or surrender to spare them but risk having to assault the walls when you arrive. It's a really nice grand strategy aspect, I think. Another difference between Rome 2's garrisons and Rome 3 is that garrison armies will actually appear like regular armies inside of the settlement once they spawn. In Rome 2, the garrison army exists only when the pre-battle screen loads, but for Rome 3 they will be visible as an army inside the settlement with the ability to select the units within it. Why is that important? For another tactical factor at play. In Rome 3, you will be allowed to disband garrison units. This, I think, will make a surprisingly big difference to how sieges play out. Disbanding will work the same as with regular units, since the garrison is now just a regular army that appears and disappears on the map as needed. You might disband the lower level units because you want to protect them from harm. You are essentially saying to your mob who have risen up that they should not fight because you want to protect your population numbers, limiting the garrison army to only the more effective units. This will be especially useful when you think the garrison has a chance to win a siege sally, allowing you to leave behind units that might just get wiped out by stray cav attacks or arrow volleys, and only taking troops who are much more likely to come back alive. Another strategy is, I think, a cooler one. You could disband garrison units in order to make the defending army weaker, so that the AI besiegers will feel they have an advantage and attempt a siege assault instead of starving you out. This, of course, will be risky, as in principle the AI will only do this when it really does stand a chance of winning. But for the player, it is a chance to use their skill at the game to play a desperate siege defense and weaken the enemy, if not defeat them entirely. This will be especially potent in cases where you know the enemy's army composition is unsuitable to a siege assault, meaning its strength will be less than the AI thinks it is when actually used in practice. This feature is important to the game as a whole also, as the desperate siege defense is always a favourite among players, and they are likely to create memorable and decisive battles that last in the player's memory once the campaign is done. If you can bait the enemy into this move, such battles are more likely and provide a way for high skill players to turn the tides on invaders, especially if the player has not much in the way of military left elsewhere. And everyone wants a chance to test the defences they have been constructing. Baiting the enemy to assault the walls of the settlement you have upgraded with loads of hot oil, ballista towers and moats will be very satisfying indeed. You might not need to disband garrison units at all to do this, but if the garrison is actually big enough to intimidate the enemy, this feature will give them the false confidence they need to play right into your hands. Slaves. Now, as recently promised, let's talk a bit about how slaves are used as a mechanic in Rome 3. As a reminder, in Rome 2, slaves were taken from battle captives or settlements and distributed around your regions, adding an undisclosed amount to a stat for each region called slave population, which was the percentage of the total population who were slaves. You got a straight multiplier boost to the region's tax income, but a penalty to public order, meaning you had to check it wasn't getting too high to manage now and again and ease off on the slave taking. Rome 3 will have a broadly similar but slightly deeper way of simulating slave-driven economics. As well as the percentage slave population of a region, you'll be able to see the divides of which faction these slaves originally came from. Now, for simplicity's sake, we won't go any deeper than the faction at the time of enslavement, Because you might have a case where Rome captures Athens from the Thracians, who only just took it, so technically the slaves taken would belong to Athens, not Thrace. But since slaves is a somewhat background mechanic to your military campaigns, we won't go that deep. So you'll have a breakdown of all the factions you took slaves from. This is important for two main reasons. First, that having lots of slaves from one faction will cause that faction to have a penalty to their relations with you. And second, because as a leader you will hopefully want to know where exactly people enslaved from your own faction are, so you can get them back. To return once again to the example from earlier of the Arverni attacking Tolosa, let's say instead of capturing it, they chose to enslave the population, reducing it from 17,000 to 5,000, the remainder assumed to be those not sufficiently productive looking to make into slaves, and there just so that the settlement isn't totally unviable after an enslavement, as that might make the game drag. Sometime later, you come across an Arverni town. Your spy infiltrates and lets you look at the slave population. There are 1,000 Romans in there, time to head to the rescue. The enemy garrison is only a few hundred men, the rest haven't been taken to join the main force or now doing something unknown, so the town surrenders when you attack. Among the usual post-battle options, which will be covered themselves later on, you have a message telling you that 1,000 of your people have been found. You have the option to send them home, or if you have a more controlling faction type, you can order them to stay so that they can occupy the settlement and immediately have 1,000 Romans in the population, giving you a greater proportion of the population who are of your culture than normal. If you're feeling really ruthless, you might also pick the option to just add them to your own slave population. As I hinted, whether you get a say on what to do with them at all would depend on your faction type. For an anarchic faction, the matter might be decided by your warriors themselves, not you as the leader. Just like in Rome too, having lots of slaves will cause public order problems, and give a chance of any rebellions occurring being slave revolts instead of political ones. Ideally, slaves would be a unique faction, like in the amazing mod for Hannibal at the Gates called Spartacus Rises, with their own set of units that are basically ragtag versions of the regular faction units, representing how slave armies are raised from stolen or scavenged equipment. A slave army might not be all that powerful, but it would have high morale since they have nothing left to lose. It would grow over time, reducing the slave population and removing the slave penalty to public order as it did so. That means you might choose to let it grow before killing it, just like rebellions in Rome too, so that you can let public order be more stable afterwards. However, remember you are killing your own assets here, and ending the rebellion before it takes all the slaves with it means having slaves left over to drive your economy once the rebels are crushed. You need to make a call based on the specific situation. The slave army will, once powerful, attempt to take the region it is stationed in. If the region has a garrison it probably won't be able to take, it will instead find one with a smaller garrison, giving you more time to intercept it. If it takes a region, that region becomes part of their little slave republic, automatically at war with you. If you are in a really tight corner, you might even make peace with this new faction to stop it growing any further, which would be a really interesting turn of events. It would be extra juicy if the slave republic, when winning battles against you, almost always took your warriors and people as slaves of their own, getting revenge on their former masters.